Hi, I'm your host, Ray Dogum, and welcome to VibeCast. VibeCast is Vibe Bio's official podcast where we explore some of the hottest topics in drug development, investment strategies, and technology innovation. Our guest today is Toni Campbell, who serves as the general partner at Kinfolk Venture Capital, a fund focused on innovation in Africa and headquartered in Lagos, Nigeria. The fund specializes in pre-seed and seed stage investments, targeting companies led by African entrepreneurs. Prior to founding Kinfolk, Toni worked at notable investment firms, including Bessemer Venture Partners and Arcadia Funds. Toni also has a bachelor's degree and MBA from Harvard. Toni, it's so great to chat with you today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. And why don't we get started with having you sort of tell the community what brought you into this investment world?
Well, first of all, Ray, thank you so much for having me. Been really excited, to join, Vodcast. I guess, just to answer that quick question, I think one of my favorite quotes is "Life can only really be understood backwards, even though it's lived forward." But I guess what got me into VC. I think it's just really a combination of a weird set of unique experiences, backgrounds, communities that I've just really been privileged to be part of, over the course of my life. So I guess when it comes to VC in Africa specifically, the context is, I was born and raised in Nigeria, so I am African myself, but I also had, this unique experience of emigrating to the United States when I was relatively young. And then also when I was in school, the communities I was ultimately surrounded by, just really gave me, this zeitgeist about, the power and potential of technology. Not only in daily life, but also, in terms of business. And, that really, fired, some of my neurons to try to understand, okay, what exactly are these, so-called angel investors, these VCs doing? How, in many ways, are they able to identify, if not support these companies? Taking a company that's literally quite, started in, college dorm room and transform it into, multi-billion-dollar, now trillion-dollar business that is now Facebook. So just out of that sheer curiosity in many ways, I think that's what really, drove me towards, VC as an industry, even though it's still very much a cottage industry when we look at it globally, even though it has this outsized impact on, so many things that we kind of take for granted, in daily life. And then Africa specifically, again, connected back to my, my background as a Nigerian, as an African. Again, I think it was just really all about timing. I think this was roughly around maybe 2016 or so, while I was also working in Northern California when, two companies, came through YC, a company called Flutterwave and another company called Paystack. These were Nigerians equivalent to Stripe at the time. And I think that was also just like a light bulb moment for me, recognizing that, that same zeitgeist that I thought was just so unique to my own college experience actually perhaps happened in so many other, college communities, even across, large parts of Africa. And, recognizing that, I think I quickly realized that, maybe I should pay a little more attention to what's going on at home in terms of tech. And that's just really snowballed into everything that that I'm working on today, with my team at Kinfolk. We're really now, anchored towards, that idea, that purpose in many ways that, we can support, if not identify, and then also, and collaboratively build, some of the world's, transformative tech companies in Africa as they are being built in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And when you moved from Africa to the United States, did you have this idea in your mind where you eventually wanted to go back and try to, help develop some of the communities within the African continent? Or were you sort of like, yeah.
I moved to the United States when I was about 7, 8 years old, right? So, I think for me, my first formative experiences in the United States were, understanding just how cold snow was. I don't think I was really forming any ideas of, what I actually wanted to do, much later on. With that being said, right, I think one of the things that actually was really powerful for me was the fact that, my parents, made it, quite important for, myself as well as my siblings, and to actually really stay connected to our roots. It was even as simple as like, making sure we were always eating Nigerian food at home, staying in touch with our family members, also going back home, over the summer. And, as I was getting older, especially, just before I'm, going to college, some of those, elements of curiosity just popped into my mind. Why is it that, Nigeria, went in this direction in terms of whether economic or political development, versus United States, which is, the most advanced, the most powerful country in the world. Like, those questions just sat in my head. With that being said, right, you can explore those questions academically without really having any interest or actually wanting to experience it yourself. But to be honest, I can't really remember when that impetus really came, other than the fact that, that light bulb moment that I think I had, while I was, doing venture investing in California, made me realize, wait a minute, like there are actually a lot of more similarities that, as long as you look in the right places, there are a lot more similarities than there are actually differences between, an entrepreneurial experience in, the chaotic city that is Lagos, Nigeria, or, Nairobi, Kenya, as there is in San Francisco, as there is in New York, as there is in London. People, in many ways, are capable of building great businesses that can ultimately impact their local markets. And, just given those unique advantages that I had in terms of the network, that I potentially tap into as an African, as a Nigerian, the context in many ways that I was blessed to have. I think that's what also just made me lean forward into this, as opposed to focusing just exclusively on the United States, for example.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience at the investment firms you did work at, and then sort of what made you transition into founding your own VC firm?
Yeah. So my first formative experience in terms of investing was at Bessemer. And I think Bessemer is rather unique in that it's, I would say, one of the few firms, certainly then, maybe not so much, unique now, that made it a priority in many ways to actually hire, young, somewhat idealistic, students right out of college, and give them basically a front row seat, to how the sausage is made at a venture capital firm. And one of the other unique experiences, that I had was, as opposed to basically being hidden in the back, made to do all this, modeling, analysis, whatever, we were actually considered to be, part of the front line of the firm, right? The culture of the firm, and I think it still persists today, is that, you have to go out there and ultimately form relationships with founders. You need to go out there and find those founders before anyone else does. Learn more about their businesses. In many ways, actually, I think the way that one of the partners I had the unique privilege of working closely with, described it to me was, this job is actually less about being an Excel monkey, and it's more about being almost like an investigative journalist. So go out there, find some great entrepreneurs, but most importantly, find a great story that not only resonates with you, but one that you think it can actually have a really transformative impact, not only financially, but certainly maybe even socially, right? And that, I think, really just shaped my orientation and my approach to venture, right? I think oftentimes we think of companies just really more about the dollars and the cents that we see on a P&L or a cash flow statement, but companies are really fundamentally about people. There are about founders and the aspirations that they have, and recognizing in many ways that that potential can quite literally come from anywhere. It's not really concentrated in a few universities or a few parts of the world. It's potentially global. But finding that story, finding that founder that you can ultimately resonate, that you can develop a close working relationship with, and consistently work with, and support, to build a truly transformative business. That's part and parcel, one of the most exciting parts of the job. And then I would say that, another experience that I think really drove me towards, founding Kinfolk was, just recognizing that, in terms of the global financial markets that we have right now, and have had, for quite some time, capital is very concentrated in certain parts of the world, even though, opportunities or talent, in many ways, are actually evenly distributed across the world. And, as opposed to just investing, in the same, sets of companies or founders or communities, whether in Northern California, whether in North America, whether increasingly in Western Europe, I felt in many ways that, myself, in addition to some of the, individuals I'm privileged to work with at Kinfolk, had this, responsibility in many ways to begin to, help shift a little bit, just a little, maybe even just like a little bit of the capital, that exists in North America, towards, the African continent, such that, a lot, some of these founders who in many ways are just short of capital, not short of ideas, not short of passion, not short of, talent, can be able to actually pursue, their own dreams, build their own stories in the same way that, countless number of founders in the United States and elsewhere, currently have.
Yeah, and just for the audience's sake, I just want to make something clear is other investors we've had on are more biotech folks investors. And with Kinfolk and also at Bessemer, it's more agnostic to the sector, actually. So it's more about the innovation, as you said, the story, the entrepreneurs, the value that it could bring to society. So, and I think, you're still looking at health sector opportunities as well. It's not like you're not looking at that. And so I just wanted to kind of clarify that in case anyone is wondering. But if you are a biotech company out there interested, I encourage you to check out Kinfolk for sure, because, they would love to talk to you. And I think you should love to talk to them as well.
For sure.
Actually, on that topic, why don't you explain your investment thesis?
Yeah. So I think our investment thesis really just boils down in many ways to, understanding and recognizing that, Kinfolk in many ways has the potential to actually have a transformative impact on the African continent, provided that we support a select group of high potential entrepreneurs and provide them with, the resources, the networks, the tools they need to succeed. Right. And not only can this approach really generate, substantial financial returns for us and our investors, but it can actually have a meaningful social impact by contributing in many ways to the transformation of Africa as a whole. Right. And there are a number of categories, certainly, healthcare, which I think is probably most relevant to, your audience, but, healthcare, education, energy. I mean, these are massive categories where, entrepreneurs, especially technology entrepreneurs, can be building great businesses that can solve some of, these problems that the continent is just basically in many ways seen as intractable for generations. So, I mean, that's really our theory of change, right? Generations ago, decades, centuries ago, the theory that a lot of people, or the working theory that individuals and, institutions had towards how we change Africa is, through economic aid, right? 2 centuries ago, during the age of colonialism, the theory of change was, we can change Africa through, religious missionaries, right? Whereas, our, true core theory of change is that, the individuals that actually have the most capacity to change the continent are the entrepreneurs who actually live within these communities, who are short of resources, not necessarily short of ideas and talent, and to make that meaningful, transformation by building businesses in many ways that can transform their local markets and then ultimately the world.
Yeah, it's sort of like that saying, you give a man a fish, he gets to eat for a day. You teach him how to fish, to eat they could self-sustain for a lifetime. Right, exactly. Can you describe the state of innovation for African entrepreneurs, in terms of the ecosystem, the support that they have in Africa, maybe even global hubs that are starting to form in parts of Africa?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess when it comes to the state of innovation, I tend to take a little bit more of a nuanced approach, right? Don't get me wrong. I am long, African tech. I basically committed, probably at least the next 10 years of my life, just given, what an average fund, cycle looks like, to this, mission. With that being said, right, despite the tremendous amount of potential that exists right now on the continent, there's still a lot of barriers that I think entrepreneurs in general typically face, right? Yes, there's been a lot of positive developments in the right way, right? There have been, great, and fantastic hubs that have emerged in different parts of the continent. Certainly, the innovation communities and, 3 cities, Cape Town, Lagos, and Nairobi are by far the most vibrant. With that being said, right, whether it's, the barriers that entrepreneurs face in terms of access to capital, certainly related to mentorship, also just, the general experience that, right, as a whole, the African ecosystem is probably no older than 2014, 2015 max. So, that level of pattern recognition that we also kind of take for granted, in the United States and elsewhere, hasn't really fully, matured in the same way. But despite all of that, right, the potential is really there, and in many ways, we're actually beginning to see the fruits of that potential. I'm really excited to actually see that the first meaningful waves of exits are now beginning to happen. Back in 2021, I think the big exit that got everybody really excited was the sale of Paystack to Stripe, for north of $300 million. Paystack is effectively Nigeria's equivalent of Stripe, helping typically tech businesses, but also increasingly small businesses, in the real economy, be able to actually collect digital payments and online payments in a simple way. But now we're actually beginning to see exits in other sectors, B2B SaaS, for example, and that's now beginning to change, I would say, the tenor and at least the perception of the viability of the ecosystem as a whole. So I think generally, speaking, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of demonstration of that potential, especially as of late. But I think we also need to be cognizant of the fact that there are still a number of structural barriers that actually really prevent, or at least are slowing down in many ways, the ability of African entrepreneurs, by and large, to really capitalize on this tremendous amount of potential that they have. Whether it's the engineering talent that is growing by leaps and bounds on the continent, the novel as well as low cost business models that oftentimes you're just forced to build on the continent, but also have this remarkable potential to scale really, really efficiently and really well off the continent. So just looking at the overall state of innovation, I'm still incredibly bullish, but also recognizing that there's still actually a lot more work to do in terms of really just opening up the floodgates in many ways of capital, of resources, of just basic mindshare and thought leadership that I think the continent is very much deserving of, but also is quite poised to actually do in due time.
Yeah, so they say Africa is the next big growth company that's up and coming. Just because of a lot of the leapfrogging of technology in that continent seems to be very important. That digital currencies you were talking about, just even like Wi-Fi satellite technology. So, very
solar.
curious. Solar, absolutely, solar on different types of crop yields and things going on there. In terms of like synthetic biology and stuff. But let's talk about some of your investments in the companies you've worked and that you're working with, your portfolio companies. Can you talk about some of them?
Yeah, well, I just hope I don't get in trouble from any of our portfolio company leaders, and being accused for playing favorites. But I would say, one of the companies within our portfolio that I'm actually quite excited about right now is a company called Norebase. And what they essentially offer, I would say, is quite simple, but it has this transformative impact not only for tech entrepreneurs, but also I would just say for small business owners generally. And I think we kind of take for granted that one of the biggest barriers, I would say, for just general economic development across the 54 countries of Africa is that a significant, if not large part of the economies of these countries are largely informal, right? You have small business owners in many ways that, have not necessarily formalized their businesses. They haven't created business entities. They haven't, established, at least the benefits that we kind of take for granted about, limited liability. And a lot of that is not necessarily because, business owners don't intellectually understand, the benefits of formalization, because, they know that if they formalize, they'll be able to get access to a business bank account, loans, government support, we saw, throughout much of the Western world, in times of crisis, the ability to trade across borders, et cetera. But some of the biggest issues that they face is that they just don't know really how to go about it, right? Or the cost of formalization sometimes is just way too cost prohibitive, right? Because of the high cost of paying lawyers, to create the necessary documents, the filing fees, you have to interact with government officials, the time and the expense, related to formalization as a whole. So, step in, our portfolio company, Norebase, they quite literally built a software platform that provides, and essentially streamlines and increasingly is now automating the entire business formation process for small business owners across the continent. So if I'm an entrepreneur looking to start a high growth tech business, as well as someone who's quite literally looking to start a restaurant, you can go to Norebase within minutes, provide the necessary information, everything from your government identification, et cetera, what type of business you're looking to build. And you can basically register a business almost instantly. And the beauty of their model too is now that they're beginning to establish more of a partnership approach. They're offering APIs now that other companies can essentially integrate into their own apps. One of the best examples is a fintech company in Nigeria that offers point of sale software solutions to companies. But what happens, for example, if you want to sell your point of sale solution to a business owner or a business leader that actually doesn't have a business entity? With Norebase's API now integrated within that software application, regardless of whether or not that business actually already has an entity or does not, you can start that company formation process in order to actually formalize the business and begin to provide them with financial services. And one of the stats I think I'm actually really excited about is perhaps later this month, or maybe at most early next month, Norebase will cross the 2 million new registered businesses mark across the continent, and that's just a tremendous level of I would say just impact in many ways that we've ultimately established across the continent so far.
Yeah, and I think when this episode actually publishes, it'll be that time. So that's really great to hear. Really exciting stuff. And you can kind of, with Norebase specifically, you kind of see how that can help even government institutions start to think about how to more formally promote and support these companies too, because they kind of work together,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Norebase actually sees itself being a broader platform for a bunch of different stakeholders in many ways to actually just support, small businesses, right? I mean, they see it in many ways as like a compliance as a service platform. So it's not only just helping businesses register, but it's also like, to help them stay compliant over time, right? The reason why governments love Norebase increasingly is that once you help businesses formalize, the next step typically is let's help them file taxes. Right. If the company is profitable, that's great. That's tax revenue that's ultimately going to the state. If they're not, right, is this an instance where a government can actually step in and provide, support, whether in the form of tax credits or subsidies or whatever, right? Also for, lightly regulated or highly regulated, business industries, right? Getting the necessary licenses, the permitting, to ensure that, the quality and, of the business operations, are consistent across the country, right? Basically doing everything possible to, bring small business owners and leaders, out from the margins and really into the formal economy, right? And that really begins to actually help catalyze and, build momentum in these economies, because, if all these small business owners are hidden in the, the crooks and crannies of the economy, governments can't necessarily be proactive. And similarly, those businesses in many ways will hit a barrier that actually prevents them from scaling if they can't access, financial services from banks, if they can't, sell their goods and services, outside of the small local community, across, a nation or even across borders, right? So I think I completely agree with you, right? It's not only governments, but I mean, there's a whole entire ecosystem, that surrounds every business and every single business leader. But you only really get that benefit, once you actually have, a legal personality to your business that can essentially help these stakeholders, collaborate with that business over time.
Very interesting. That's great. What sectors are you most interested in Africa?
Yeah. So I would say much like everybody, that's crowded into Africa quite late, fintech, I would say, is where the bulk of capital is ultimately, been deployed across the continent, right? But for us, I mean, I think in many ways we see fintech as, the first layer of infrastructure that has been built, that has been funded, over the last, 5 to 7 years now. Now we're increasingly looking at, the next level of the stack. And, one of the areas that I think we're most excited about are, companies that are essentially building, business to business software solutions, whether targeting SMEs or targeting large enterprises, that can really leverage, some of those, transformative, investments that have been made in fintech over time, right? One of the areas, for example, that, we were early in was payroll software, right? This is a constant, business operation that every single company, both large and small, needs to take care of. And in many ways, I think COVID was also kind of transformative across the continent in that forced a lot of small business owners to actually say, wait, I need to actually I need to have more resiliency in my business. I can't just rely on everything being done in person in the office. What are some tools that I can actually use in order to essentially conduct, basic business operations remotely, no matter, the condition of, the world at, at that time, right? So, payroll software, we're also increasingly really excited about companies building, really, specialized vertical software. For example, in healthcare, we're quite excited about companies that are looking to essentially, provide software for, the back office and administrative functions of, physicians, of clinics, across large parts of Africa. Just the very act of, scheduling time, to see your doctor, and we kind of take for granted in most parts of the world. Most people don't schedule an appointment with their doctor; they just walk in, right? And that ends up being, an administrative headache sometimes, for some of these physicians across the continent if they can't necessarily predict what demand looks like over time. They can't necessarily allocate resources in order to, manage that demand. So, providing software in many ways to actually help some of those administrative challenges of, all types of businesses, quite frankly, but also looking very narrowly at some very specific verticals where, having a deeper understanding of the challenges of those business owners and those business leaders can really inform the type of software that's being built, as well as the operational efficiency, ideally, that those businesses, those verticals can really experience with the application of software.
Right, as they scale. I appreciate that. So I know you talk to a lot of founders all the time. You see pitch decks all the time as well. What do you wish more founders knew before pitching to VCs?
That's a good question, actually. I think the one thing that I would say is I think founders maybe think they know, but I don't think they actually ever fully appreciate just like the scale and the volume of pitches that VCs by and large ultimately receive, right? And that's both a incredible privilege to have. We oftentimes have this unique vantage point, basically seeing trends as they are unfolding in real time. But I would say also the other flip side of that level of volume is that we oftentimes, we just see a lot of similar companies at the same time, and we can't really make sense of who exactly we need to back. Or alternatively, the volume and the scale of which that we actually see all these entrepreneurs, prevents us from actually being able to focus and actually really go deep on maybe more than a few, really narrow areas at a time, right? I think oftentimes, founders approach VCs expecting, to learn, from VCs, when in fact, I oftentimes actually see, my role in any of the interactions between founders and us as the opportunity for me to learn more from that founder about their perspective, their, sub-industry vertical that they're focused on. What is their theory of change in many ways for the problem that they've identified in the world? So I would say that's probably one of the things that I wish more founders ultimately, knew, just the volume and the scale at which that we're constantly having to, process information, combined with the fact that, with that volume of information, we can't really become, sector specialists in the same way that they are. And if anything, like I'm always eager to actually learn more from people who have that ability to actually really focus narrowly on, a set of problems as opposed to, the broad generalist view, no matter if you want to be, just only focused on a specific industry. at, just the volume and the scale of deal flow, forces you to actually, orient your mind towards.
Yeah, you got to stand out somehow. So good answer. Thank you. And maybe I think you sort of like answer this, but I kind of want to ask specifically, what is the most challenging aspect about being a VC?
Ooh.
Aside from having to learn so many things, getting all the volume, I guess.
Yeah, I think the most challenging aspect, this is going to sound funny, but one of my favorite Pixar films is Ratatouille. And the last speech in Ratatouille is actually one that I think probably describes the role of VC like very much or very well. I can't remember the actual the words, but I mean I would encourage everybody to actually look it up. It's a speech that the anti-hero villain character at the end makes, and he basically unpacks the fact that the work of a critic in many ways in life is actually very easy, right? And in many ways, I actually kind of see what we do as VCs just as criticism, right? Just given the scale at which most firms, most individuals at this point, receive deal flow, we're lucky if more than 5% of the deals that or the opportunities that we see, founders that we see, we actually choose to invest in, right? That means 95% of the time we're actually saying no, and we're criticizing the individual who's ultimately, presenting us with, that idea, that company, that vision, right? And yet we're kind of risking very little, right? We somewhat enjoy this position where, we offer, people offer up their work, their life's ambition, to us, for judgment. And I've always actually found that a little bit disconcerting because, the bitter truth is, in the grand scheme of things, the founder is probably taking way more risk than we ever are, as VCs, right?
Well, you're sort of diversifying the risk, right? You have multiple
exactly.
companies. The founder's all in on one thing. So I can see how that makes sense. Sure.
And, for me, I think that's always just been a little bit of an intellectual, challenge because, we're not risking that much, right? I mean, of course we are risking, capital at the end of the day, right? But it's oftentimes really difficult for me, when I see just how passionate, a founder is about a particular space. But then, when I step back and I, have to ask my, that, age-old question I think every VC asks, but is this actually venture backable, right? Does this actually scale? And 95% of the time I have to make that decision and say no. And, just seeing in many ways how, you can deflate, the passion, the potential maybe even of an individual, it's hard.
Yeah.
And it's not for the faint of heart, constantly having to be in a job where, 95 out of 100 times, almost every single day, you have to say no.
That's a really good answer. I appreciate that. And I'm going to watch Ratatouille tonight too. So thanks for the suggestion. Toni, this has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining VibeCast. If anyone listening here enjoyed this, please like, comment, share, subscribe. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts too. Toni, is there anything else you kind of wanted to share with the audience before we conclude here?
Yeah, well, I guess, I'd love if everybody just paid a little closer attention to what's going on the African continent. So many great entrepreneurs, so many great developers who are basically on the precipice of, making their own, dent in the sky, so to speak. So I really hope that everybody, after listening to this, spends a little bit more time exploring some of the opportunities that are bound to, emerge from the continent.
I love it. Perfect. Thanks, Toni, and really appreciate your time. Talk soon.
Thanks, Ray.